The screaming stopped at exactly 3:47 a.m. on the 13th of October, 1982, yet the dogs in Harlan County kept howling until dawn. This wasn't the first time silence had fallen like a blade across the Cumberland Mountains, slicing through air thick with cold dust and festering secrets. What happened in those Kentucky hills over 3 decades reveals how isolation can warp a bloodline into something monstrous, and how an entire community can choose to be blind to the truth. The creak of rotting porch boards, the metallic tang of rusted well water, the damp earth that never quite dried, these were the textures of Copperhead Hollow. For over a century, the McCready family had lived, bred, and buried their sins in this secluded place. Counting the 43 souls here always proved tricky. The hollow itself stretched like a scar between 2 ridges. Accessible only by a gravel road, the county stopped maintaining in the 1962nd. Mail came only twice a week, and only when the postal worker remembered. Electricity arrived in 1974, but most families still used kerosene lamps, either from habit or stubborn pride. The McCready compound sat at the hollow's dead end, where a creek bent around a cluster of trailers and lean-tos that seemed to multiply like mushrooms after a rain. By 1980, 3 generations of McCreadys lived within shouting distance. Patriarch Ezekiel, his 6 children, and a growing brood of grandchildren, whose parentage was as blurred as watercolors in a downpour. Their family tree looked less like a tree and more like a tangled, dense, and dangerous thorn bush. County records showed 14 births at the compound between 1975 and 1982, but only 9 death certificates were ever filed. The first hint that something was wrong came from a social worker named Margaret Finley, who made the mistake of trying to enroll the McCready children in school. Her report from the 5th of September, 1981, described severe developmental delays, consistent with prolonged isolation and nutritional deficiencies. She noted that several children appeared to have identical facial features despite being listed as cousins. Even more disturbing, the youngest children seemed unnaturally fearful of adults outside their family. Margaret's supervisor buried the report. He rationalized that mountain families had their ways and the McCreadys weren't harming anyone. Besides, Ezekiel McCready had friends in the sheriff's department, men who remembered when his moonshine kept their own families fed. In the mountains, some silences are worth keeping, but the hollow itself began to change. Hunters reported that game trails avoided the McCready property, as if the animals sensed something predators instinctively fear. The creek that ran past their compound started running murky year-round, with sediment that didn't match the local geology. And at night, when the wind was right, neighbors heard sounds that didn't belong to any creature they recognized. Something was growing in the dark. By the summer of 1982, the youngest McCready children had stopped venturing beyond the tree line. The older ones emerged only to trade pelts and jars of clear liquid for supplies in town. Their eyes never quite met those of the store clerks who served them. They moved with a careful silence, the kind people learn when noise invites attention, and attention invites pain. What do you do if you suspect something unspeakable is happening just 5 miles from your home, but every instinct tells you that looking too closely might make you the next victim? The answer came on that October night when Deputy Sheriff Michael Torres decided to investigate reports of gunshots from the hollow. He was about to discover that some family trees grow their roots in ground too poisoned to sustain anything resembling humanity. Deputy Michael Torres had seen plenty of mountain families living rough, but the smell hit him before he even stepped out of his patrol car. It was a mix of sweet decay, wood smoke, and something else that turned his stomach. This wasn't poverty. This was something that had learned to hide behind poverty's familiar face. What Torres found that night would haunt Kentucky State Police files for decades, becoming the kind of case veteran investigators only whispered about. The gravel crunched under his boots as he approached the main trailer, a double-wide that sagged in the middle like a broken spine. His flashlight beam caught movement in the windows, shadows that seemed to dart away from the light with unnatural speed. The air tasted of copper and fear. 3 children emerged from behind a rusted pickup truck. Their ages were impossible to determine. They could have been 8 or 18. Malnutrition and something else had stunted their growth in ways that defied easy categorization. Their clothes hung in tatters, but their eyes held a feral intelligence, watching, calculating, waiting. The oldest, a girl with matted hair that might once have been blonde, spoke in a dialect so thick Torres had to strain to understand. "Ain't supposed to be here after dark," she said, her voice carrying an authority that belonged to someone much older. "Granddaddy don't like strangers." Torres identified himself, explaining he was responding to reports of gunfire. The children exchanged glances that seemed to communicate volumes without a word. The girl tilted her head toward the largest trailer, where warm light leaked through torn curtains. Through the thin walls, Torres could hear what sounded like a family dinner, the clink of utensils, low conversation, and someone laughing at a joke he couldn't quite make out. His radio crackled. "Unit 7, what's your status?" Torres hesitated. Protocol demanded he call for backup, but backup was 40 minutes away on mountain roads that grew treacherous after dark. The children watched him with the patience of hunters waiting for their prey to make the first mistake. When he knocked on the trailer door, the sounds inside stopped immediately. Complete silence, as if everyone had simply vanished. Then, slow footsteps, deliberate and measured. The door opened to reveal Ezekiel McCready himself, a man Torres recognized from old arrest photos, though the years had carved him into something harder and more angular. His smile revealed teeth filed to points, a modification Torres had never seen outside of prison gang files. "Evening, deputy. A bit late for social calls, ain't it?" Behind Ezekiel, Torres could see into the trailer's main room. A long table dominated the space, set for what appeared to be a feast. Steam rose from serving dishes, and the rich smell of cooked meat filled the air. But something about the scene felt wrong. The proportions were off, the shadows fell at strange angles, and the other family members sitting around the table seemed frozen in place, their forks halfway to their mouths. It was a feast that never ended. Torres counted 7 adults, and at least a dozen children. In the dim light, it was hard to tell where one person ended and another began. They sat so still they might have been mannequins, except for their eyes, which tracked his every movement with the focused attention of predators evaluating a potential meal. Just checking on reports of gunshots, Torres managed, his hand instinctively moving to his service weapon, making sure everyone's safe. Ezekiel's filed teeth caught the light as his smile widened. "Safe as houses, deputy. Just doing a little night hunting. These mountains, they're full of things that only come out after dark." The statement hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Torres knew he should press further, demand to search the property, and assert his authority. But the eyes watching him from inside the trailer held a hunger that transcended mere poverty or desperation. This was a hunger that had been feeding for a long time, and it had developed a taste for more than just the deer and rabbits roaming these hills. What does a lawman do when he realizes some laws were never meant to reach into certain dark corners of the world? As Torres backed toward his patrol car, he caught sight of something that would appear in his nightmares for years to come. A child's bicycle partially buried behind the main trailer. Its small wheels were still spinning slowly in the mountain breeze. The bicycle belonged to Amy Chen, age 7, who had disappeared from a camping trip 6 months earlier. Torres recognized it instantly. The purple frame with silver streamers had been plastered on every missing person flyer in eastern Kentucky. This single piece of evidence transformed what might have been dismissed as mountain eccentricity into something far more sinister, connecting the McCready compound to a string of disappearances stretching back nearly 2 decades. Torres photographed the bicycle with hands that shook, despite his years of training. The streamers moved in the night breeze like fingers beckoning him deeper into the hollow secrets. State police records would later reveal a pattern that local law enforcement had somehow failed to notice. Children vanishing along a corridor that stretched from Harlan County north, through Pike and Floyd counties. The victims were always from families camping, hiking, or traveling through the remote mountain areas. A total of 23 children between the ages of 5 and 12 had gone missing in that region since 1964. 23 families were left to wonder what had happened to their sons and daughters in the vast wilderness of Appalachian Kentucky. The official explanation was always the same. Children wandered off, got lost in the dense forest, or fell into hidden mine shafts or swift-running creeks. The mountains were dangerous, rangers explained to grieving parents. Accidents happened. Bodies were rarely recovered in such rugged terrain, and families were encouraged to find closure without physical remains. But Torres now understood that some of those children had never been lost at all. They had been found. Back in his patrol car, Torres radioed for backup and requested immediate contact with the state police. But as he spoke into the microphone, he became aware of shapes moving in the darkness around his vehicle. The McCready children had emerged from their hiding places and were circling his car with the coordinated precision of a pack. Their movements were silent, deliberate, and utterly inhuman in their synchronization. The oldest girl appeared at his passenger window, her face pressed against the glass. In the green glow of his dashboard lights, Torres could see that her canine teeth had been filed to points, just like her grandfather's. She mouthed words he couldn't hear through the glass, but her meaning was clear. He wasn't leaving the hollow tonight. His radio erupted in static. No matter how he adjusted the frequency, he couldn't raise dispatch. The children began rocking his patrol car, gently at first, then with increasing violence. Torres drew his service weapon, but found himself unable to aim it at children, even children whose eyes reflected light, like nocturnal predators, and whose fingernails had been sharpened into claws. The innocence that was never innocent. From his police academy training, Torres remembered reading about the Sawney Bean clan in 16th century Scotland, a family of cannibals who preyed on travelers for decades. The case had been presented as a historical curiosity, an example of how isolation could corrupt human nature. But sitting in his patrol car surrounded by the McCready children, Torres realized some horrors didn't stay buried in history books. A report filed by Kentucky State Police Detective Frank Morrison on the 2nd of November, 1982, would later describe finding evidence of systematic predation at the compound. Morrison's team discovered personal belongings from at least 15 missing children hidden throughout the property, along with crude drawings that appeared to show hunting techniques specifically adapted for capturing young humans. But on that October night, Torres had only his instincts and his growing certainty that he had stumbled into something that would challenge every assumption he had ever made about the nature of evil. The children stopped rocking his car and began to sing a lullaby in their thick dialect, their voices harmonized in ways human voices shouldn't be able to. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, and Torres found himself growing drowsy despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. He understood with crystal clarity that this was how they had lured the camping children away from their families, with songs that promised safety, warmth, and something that looked like love from a distance. What kind of family teaches its children to hunt other children? And what kind of society allows such a family to perfect their techniques across multiple generations? As the singing grew louder, Torres saw lights approaching through the trees. They were not the searchlights of his backup, but the flickering glow of torches carried by the adult members of the McCready clan, moving toward his position with the patient inevitability of a rising tide. The torches moved through the trees like fallen stars, each flame casting dancing shadows that transformed the familiar forest into a maze of lurking threats. Torres counted at least 12 figures approaching from different directions. Their movements were coordinated with the precision of hunters who had practiced this dance many times before. This wasn't random violence or desperate poverty. This was a family business, refined across generations and passed down like recipes or farming techniques. The radio in Torres's patrol car had gone completely dead, not even static, breaking the electronic silence. His backup wasn't coming, and even if it was, 40 minutes might as well have been 40 hours. Ezekiel McCready emerged from the largest trailer, carrying a modified hunting rifle with a shortened barrel and a stock carved with symbols that seemed to writhe in the torchlight. Behind him walked a woman Torres hadn't seen before, tall, gaunt, with iron-grey hair braided with what looked like small bones. She moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "That's Granny McCready," the girl at his window whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "She's the one who teaches us the old ways, the hungry ways." Torres tried his engine. It turned over once, then died with a mechanical hiss that sounded almost like laughter. The children began backing away from his car, their job apparently finished. Whatever they had done to disable his vehicle, they had done it quietly and efficiently while he was distracted by their singing. A Kentucky State Police forensics report from the 15th of December, 1982, would later detail the modifications found throughout the McCready compound. Hidden pits covered with branches and leaves, snare traps sized for small humans, and a network of underground tunnels that connected the various trailers and outbuildings. The family had turned their entire property into a hunting preserve designed for one specific type of prey. But Torres didn't know about the tunnels yet. He didn't know about the preservation techniques the family had developed, or the careful record-keeping that tracked each victim's age, weight, and nutritional value. All he knew was that he was trapped in a place where the normal rules of civilization had been suspended for so long that their absence had become a tradition. The torchbearers formed a loose circle around his patrol car, staying just beyond the reach of his headlights. They weren't advancing yet, but they weren't retreating either. They were waiting for something, a signal, perhaps, or simply the right moment. Torres had investigated enough hunting accidents to recognize the behavior. They were giving their prey time to exhaust itself with panic before moving in for the kill. The patient hunger. Granny McCready raised one skeletal hand, and the circling figures stopped moving. Her voice carried clearly across the hollow, speaking in the same thick dialect, but with an authority that made the words sound like ancient incantations. "Been a long time since we had us a lawman. Last one was back in 2068, a state trooper who got too curious about the missing hikers." Torres's blood turned to ice. He remembered that case from the academy. Trooper Daniel Kellerman, who had vanished while investigating reports of missing campers in the Daniel Boone National Forest. His patrol car had been found abandoned, its doors open and radio crackling with unanswered calls. The official report listed him as missing and presumed dead, a victim of a hiking accident. Danny Kellerman fought real good, Granny McCready continued, her voice carrying a note of professional respect. Took 3 of the boys to bring him down, but he was tough, all muscle and gristle. "You look like you might be more tender." The children had completely disappeared now, melting back into the darkness with supernatural silence. Torres understood that they were taking positions around his vehicle, cutting off any possible escape routes. This family had been perfecting their hunting techniques for decades, and he was about to become their latest field test. What do you do when you realize that the badge and uniform that represent law and order mean nothing to people who have created their own system of justice, one based on hunger rather than morality? As if responding to some unheard signal, the torchbearers began moving again, closing their circle with the methodical patience of people who knew their prey had nowhere to run. Torres made his decision in the space between heartbeats. He wasn't going to die sitting in a disabled patrol car like a gift-wrapped present. He kicked open his door and rolled into the darkness beyond his headlights, using every shadow and depression in the ground to stay hidden from the advancing torchbearers. This desperate gamble would save his life, but it would also reveal the true scope of what the McCready family had built. Over 3 generations, the ground beneath Torres's feet felt wrong, too soft in some places, too firm in others, as if the earth itself had been extensively modified. Within minutes of leaving his vehicle, he discovered why. His foot broke through what appeared to be solid ground, revealing a carefully camouflaged entrance to a tunnel system that honeycombed the entire hollow. The tunnels were hand-dug, but expertly reinforced with salvaged timber and corrugated metal, creating a subterranean network that connected every building on the property. More disturbing were the side chambers he glimpsed by the light of his failing flashlight, small cell-like spaces with heavy wooden doors and crude ventilation systems. A forensic anthropologist's report filed 6 months later would describe finding the remains of at least 37 individuals in various stages of preservation throughout the system. Dr. Sarah Martinez's clinical language couldn't quite mask her horror. Evidence suggests systematic processing of human remains for consumption, with particular attention paid to preservation techniques that would extend storage time. But Torres didn't have the luxury of clinical detachment. He could hear the Macreadys above ground, coordinating their search with whistles and calls that sounded more animal than human. Their torchlight occasionally filtered down through hidden openings, creating moving patterns of light and shadow that made navigation a nightmare of wrong turns and dead ends. In one side chamber, Torres discovered something that nearly broke his sanity. Children's clothing, neatly folded and organized by size, tiny shoes arranged in rows, stuffed animals positioned as if they were still being played with, and scratched into the wooden walls were dozens of names with dates beside them, an inventory of victims stretching back to 1959. Some of the dates corresponded to missing children's cases Torres recognized. Others were so old, the families who had lost those children were likely dead themselves. The Macready family had been hunting for over 2 decades, perfecting their techniques with each successful kill. Near the bottom of one wall, scratched in a child's uncertain handwriting, Torres found a message that stopped him cold. "My name is Tommy Walsh. Today is my birthday. I am 8 years old. If someone finds this, tell my mom and dad I love them, and I'm sorry I went with the singing lady." The entry was dated the 12th of August, 1979. Torres remembered the case. Tommy Walsh had disappeared during a family camping trip in the Daniel Boone National Forest. His parents had spent their life savings on private investigators, never knowing their son had survived long enough to carve his final message into the wall of an underground prison. Above ground, the search was getting closer. Torres could hear footsteps directly overhead and voices discussing the best way to flush him out. Someone mentioned flooding the system with smoke. Another voice suggested using the dogs, though Torres hadn't seen any animals on the property. Then he realized they weren't talking about animals. "Turn loose, the young ones," Granny Macready's voice echoed down. "They know these holes better than anybody, and they can smell fear from a mile away." The sounds that began filtering down weren't quite human, a mixture of excited yelping and what might have been laughter, if laughter could carry such hunger and anticipation. The Macready children were being released into the tunnel system, and Torres understood with crystal clarity that they had been raised for this exact purpose. What happens to children who are taught that other children are food? And how do you fight enemies who have never learned the difference between hunting and playing? In the distance, Torres could hear them coming, the scrabble of small hands and feet moving through the tunnels with the confidence of creatures that had spent their entire lives in this underground maze. The sounds approaching weren't quite footsteps, and weren't quite crawling, something in between that made Torres's skin crawl with evolutionary dread. The Macready children moved through their subterranean domain with the fluid grace of creatures perfectly adapted to their environment. This was their true home, not the ramshackle trailers above ground that served as camouflage for outsiders. Down here in the darkness, the children had been transformed into something that belonged more in nightmares than in any recognizable version of human society. Their eyes had adapted to the perpetual gloom, their hearing had sharpened to detect the slightest movement, and their understanding of morality had been shaped by lessons no child should ever learn. Torres pressed himself into a narrow alcove and tried to control his breathing as small shapes flitted past. They communicated in whispers and clicks that seemed to function as a complete language, coordinating their search with military-like efficiency. But there was something else in their voices. Excitement, anticipation, the kind of joy normal children might show while playing hide and seek. For them, this was play. The distinction between hunting and games had been erased so early in their development that they literally couldn't tell the difference between stalking a deer and stalking a human being. A child psychology evaluation conducted months later would describe this as complete moral dissociation resulting from systematic conditioning during critical developmental periods. In the main tunnel, Torres could hear them discussing strategy in their peculiar dialect. The oldest girl, the one who had spoken to him at his patrol car, seemed to be directing the others with the casual authority of a seasoned predator. She was perhaps 14, but her voice carried a cold calculation. "Deputy man's scared," she said to her siblings. "Can smell it on him, thick as molasses. But he's trying to be quiet, so he's probably military trained. Gotta be smart about this." Another voice, younger but equally confident, chimed in, found his blood trail where he scraped his hand on the rocks. "He's moving toward the old processing rooms. The education of monsters." Torres realized with growing horror that he was bleeding from a cut he'd sustained while crawling through the tunnel entrance. In the darkness, he hadn't noticed the wound, but the children's enhanced senses had picked up the scent immediately. He was leaving a trail as clear as breadcrumbs, leading them directly to his hiding place. A case file from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, compiled in 1983, would later detail the sophisticated psychological conditioning that created these children. Dr. Jennifer Hayes wrote, "The subjects display a complete absence of empathy for victims outside their family unit, combined with highly developed tactical intelligence and pack-hunting behaviors, typically seen only in apex predators. But academic analysis couldn't capture the pure terror of being hunted by children who giggled while they planned your death." Torres heard them discussing which tunnels to block off, how to drive him toward the meat rooms, and whether they should take him alive or kill him quickly. Their voices held the same casual tone that normal children might use while deciding what game to play next. The oldest girl's voice came from much closer now. "Found where he's hiding. Can hear his heartbeat from here. Sounds like a scared rabbit." Torres realized they had pinpointed his location with frightening accuracy. In desperation, he began moving deeper into the tunnel system, hoping to find another exit, or at least a more defensible position. But every turn seemed to lead to another dead end, or another chamber filled with evidence of the family's decades-long hunting spree. In one room, he discovered what appeared to be a primitive but effective preservation facility. Hooks, salt barrels, and cutting tools arranged with the orderly precision of a commercial butcher shop. The walls were lined with crude drawings that seemed to show different dismemberment techniques, annotated in the careful handwriting of someone who took pride in their craft. What kind of family passes down knowledge of human butchery, the way normal families might share recipes or farming techniques? Behind him, Torres could hear the children had stopped their pursuit. They were whispering among themselves, and there was something different in their tone, now not excitement, but concern. Then he heard the oldest girl's voice, sharp with alarm. "Somebody's coming. Big people got to get back upstairs." Through the tunnel walls, Torres could hear the distant sound of vehicle engines and shouting voices. His backup had finally arrived. The cavalry arrived in the form of 6 Kentucky State Police cruisers and 2 FBI vehicles, their red and blue lights turning the hollow into a strobing nightmare that revealed just how extensive the McCready compound truly was. But the federal agents had come for reasons that went far beyond one missing deputy. This raid was the culmination of a 2-year investigation that had connected the disappearances in eastern Kentucky to a broader pattern of missing persons cases across 3 states, all linked by a single common thread. Families who had been living off the grid for generations, sustained by resources that couldn't be accounted for through any legitimate means. The McCreadys were just one branch of a network that stretched deep into the most isolated corners of Appalachian America. Special Agent Patricia Valdez had been tracking this network since 1980, when a routine audit of missing persons reports had revealed statistical anomalies that couldn't be explained by accident or coincidence. Too many children were disappearing in areas where certain families had historical claims to large tracts of remote land. Too many of those disappearances followed similar patterns: families camping or hiking, children who wandered away from supervised areas, searches that yielded no physical evidence. The operation tonight was codenamed Harvest Moon, a designation that would prove grimly appropriate given what the investigators were about to uncover. As Torres emerged from the tunnel system, covered in dirt and blood and babbling about underground chambers filled with children's clothing, the full scope of the horror began to unfold. Agent Valdez's team moved through the compound with military precision, their tactical lights revealing details that the torchlight had mercifully concealed. The main trailer contained a kitchen that had been modified for processing large quantities of meat with industrial-grade grinders and preservation equipment that no normal family would ever need. Freezer units hummed with electrical power diverted illegally from county lines. The infrastructure of appetite. But it was the children who presented the most complex challenge for law enforcement. Ranging in age from 5 to 17, they had been so thoroughly conditioned by their environment that they couldn't understand why the raid was taking place. When agents attempted to separate them from the adult family members, several became violent, attacking officers with the coordinated ferocity of wild animals defending their pack. A psychological evaluation report filed by Dr. Maria Santos on the 3rd of December, 1982, described the children as functionally feral, displaying attachment behaviors typical of trauma bonding, but directed toward perpetrators rather than protective figures. The youngest ones had never attended school, never interacted with outsiders, never learned that the world contained any other way of living. Granny McCready, when finally cornered in the main trailer, showed no remorse or even comprehension that she had done anything wrong. Her statement to investigators, recorded on the 14th of October, 1982, revealed the twisted logic that had sustained the family's predation for decades. Ain't no different than hunting deer or rabbits. World's got too many people anyway. We just doing what nature intended. Strong eating the weak. The evidence recovered from the compound filled 3 FBI warehouse facilities. Personal belongings from victims dating back to the 1952nd, detailed records of each kill, including weights, ages, and what the family termed meat quality assessments, and photographs that documented the family's evolution from occasional opportunistic predation to systematic hunting operations. Perhaps most disturbing were the training materials. Crude manuals that documented techniques for luring children away from their families, methods for quickly disabling adult victims, and preservation techniques that maximized the usable yield from each kill. The McCreadys had turned cannibalism into a science, complete with research notes and experimental data. What do you do with children who have been raised to see other children as livestock? And how do you rehabilitate minds that have never learned the most basic human taboos? The answers to those questions would challenge the criminal justice system for years to come. But the immediate priority was determining just how many other families might be operating similar hunting grounds throughout the remote corners of America. As dawn broke over Copperhead Hollow, revealing the full extent of the underground tunnel system and the carefully concealed killing grounds, Agent Valdez received a radio call that chilled her blood. Similar compounds had been identified in West Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina. All were connected by family ties and shared methodologies that suggested a coordinated network spanning multiple generations. The phone calls started coming in before the sun had fully risen over Harlan County. Reports from law enforcement agencies across 4 states described families who had suddenly abandoned their remote properties in the middle of the night, leaving behind only empty buildings and the lingering smell of smoke from hastily burned evidence. This coordinated exodus revealed the true scope of what investigators had stumbled upon. Not an isolated family of cannibals, but a network of related clans who had been sharing information, techniques, and even victims for over a century. The McCreadys were just the tip of an iceberg that extended deep into the most forgotten corners of Appalachian culture, where isolation had allowed ancient hungers to evolve into something resembling a primitive religion. Federal agents discovered that the network operated on a rotation system. When hunting pressure became too intense in one area, families would relocate their operations to territories controlled by related clans. Children who grew up in this system learned to think of the entire mountain region as a single hunting ground, with different families controlling different sections like feudal lords dividing up a medieval kingdom. Communication between the families had evolved beyond simple word of mouth. Investigators found evidence of coded messages passed through seemingly innocent channels, classified ads in local newspapers, messages left at rural post offices, and even signals transmitted through illegal CB radio networks that operated outside federal monitoring. When the McCready compound was raided, warnings had spread through this communication system within hours. A joint task force report compiled by the FBI and ATF in March 1983 would document at least 7 related family groups operating across Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Each group controlled territory that included popular camping areas, hiking trails, and scenic routes that attracted the kind of isolated travelers who made ideal targets. The feast that traveled. The Buchanan clan in West Virginia had specialized in targeting hitchhikers along remote stretches of Interstate 77. The Crowley family in North Carolina had focused on backpackers using the Appalachian Trail. Each group had developed techniques adapted to their specific hunting grounds, but all shared the same core methodology: identify isolated victims, lure them to remote locations, and dispose of evidence in areas where searches would be difficult or impossible. What made the network particularly difficult to detect was its careful attention to victim selection. Families chose targets who wouldn't be missed immediately: drifters, runaways, tourists from distant states who had told no one about their travel plans. When victims were reported missing, the crimes had usually been committed hundreds of miles away from where the reports were filed, making it nearly impossible for local law enforcement to identify patterns. The children rescued from these compounds presented unique challenges for social services. Many had never learned to read or write, had no concept of conventional morality, and displayed symptoms that psychologists struggled to categorize. Amanda Foster, who worked with several of the rescued children, wrote, "These subjects have been conditioned to view predation as a normal family activity. They express confusion about why their lifestyle is considered problematic, similar to children of isolated religious cults. But unlike religious cults, which typically claim divine justification for their practices, the cannibal families operated from a purely pragmatic worldview. They saw their predation as a practical response to poverty and isolation, a way of ensuring survival in environments where conventional resources were scarce." Several family members, when interviewed separately, expressed genuine bewilderment that society considered their practices immoral. Ezekiel McCready, during his interrogation on the 20th of October, 1982, provided investigators with their first comprehensive look at the network structure. "Been doing this since my granddaddy's time. He learned it from his granddaddy, who learned it from the old country. Ain't nothing new about it, just folks taking care of their own when times get hard." The old country references led investigators to historical research that revealed similar practices among isolated populations in rural Scotland and Ireland during the 18th and 19th centuries, exactly the regions from which many Appalachian families had originally immigrated. The cannibalism wasn't a recent development triggered by poverty or desperation. It was a cultural tradition that had been preserved and refined across multiple generations. What happens when an entire way of life is built around predation, and how do you dismantle a network that has been operating successfully for over a century? The answer came in the form of Operation Mountain Sweep, a coordinated law enforcement action that would target all known network locations simultaneously, ensuring that no families could escape to continue their operations elsewhere. Even today, hikers in remote areas of Appalachia sometimes report finding abandoned compounds deep in the mountains, empty buildings with suspicious modifications, underground chambers that serve no obvious purpose, and an atmosphere of lingering dread that seems to seep from the very ground itself. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops. Operation Mountain Sweep launched at exactly 4 a.m. on the 15th of November, 1982, with simultaneous raids on 17 locations across 4 states, the largest coordinated law enforcement action in Appalachian history. The results exceeded even the most pessimistic projections of federal investigators. This final phase of the investigation would reveal that the network of cannibal families had been operating not for decades, but for over a century, with some family lines tracing their predatory practices back to the 1802. What had begun as desperate survival tactics during the hardest years of mountain settlement had evolved into a sustainable lifestyle that had claimed hundreds of victims across multiple generations. The evidence recovered during the raids filled an entire FBI warehouse facility in Quantico. Personal belongings from victims dating back to the 1922, photographs that documented family hunts like other families might document holiday gatherings, and genealogical records that revealed the network's true scope. Over 200 individuals across 12 extended family groups, all connected by blood, marriage, and shared methodology. Most disturbing were the children. 47 minors were recovered during the raids, ranging in age from infants to teenagers. Many had never seen electric lights or indoor plumbing. Some spoke only in the hybrid dialect that had evolved within the network, mixing archaic English with terms that seemed to come from no recognizable language. All had been raised to consider human predation as normal as hunting deer or raising livestock. Dr. Patricia Henley, the clinical psychologist assigned to evaluate the rescued children, wrote in her final report, "These subjects represent a unique case study in environmental conditioning. They have been systematically isolated from conventional moral frameworks and trained to view behaviors that society considers among the most heinous as routine family activities. The inherited hunger." The adult family members showed varying degrees of cooperation with investigators. Some, like Ezekiel McCready, seemed genuinely confused by the legal proceedings against them. Others displayed a cunning intelligence that had allowed them to operate undetected for so long, providing minimal information while carefully protecting other network members who might have escaped the raids. Granny McCready, the acknowledged matriarch of the network, proved to be the most chilling interview subject. Her statement to FBI agents on the 20th of November, 1982, provided the clearest insight into the network's mindset. "Y'all act like we invented something new. Folks been eating folks since the beginning of time. We're just honest about it. At least we don't pretend we're civilized while we're doing it." The trials that followed would stretch across 3 years and result in 47 convictions for various charges ranging from murder to kidnapping to violation of federal interstate commerce laws. But the legal proceedings couldn't address the larger questions that the case had raised about the nature of civilization itself and how easily human societies could revert to predatory behaviors when isolated from conventional moral oversight. Perhaps most troubling was the discovery that the network had maintained detailed records of their activities, treating their predation as a form of oral history that needed to be preserved for future generations. Children had been taught songs that celebrated successful hunts, stories that passed down tactical knowledge, and rituals that reinforced their separation from the soft world beyond the mountains. The last active member of the network, a woman named Sarah Buchanan, was arrested in West Virginia in 1985 while attempting to establish a new hunting ground near the New River Gorge. Her capture marked the official end of Operation Mountain Sweep, but investigators knew that other isolated families might be continuing the practices in locations that had never been identified. Deputy Michael Torres, whose discovery of the McCready compound had triggered the entire investigation, retired from law enforcement in 1984. He moved to a small town in Florida, as far from the mountains as he could manage, but neighbors reported that he kept all his curtains drawn and never answered his door after dark. What do you do with the knowledge that some horrors are too deeply rooted to be completely eliminated? And how do you sleep peacefully knowing that isolation and desperation can transform ordinary families into predators? The McCready compound was burned to the ground by federal agents in December 1982, but local residents claim that smoke still rises from that hollow on certain nights. Not from any fire that can be extinguished, but from appetites that were never fully satisfied. Even today, park rangers in remote areas of Appalachia sometimes find abandoned campsites where families have disappeared without explanation, leaving behind only empty tents and the lingering sense that something patient and hungry is still watching from the tree line. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.